In May 1939, the seemingly ordinary act of Mongolian herdsmen pasturing their horses near the Khalkhin-Gol River ignited a significant international conflict. These herdsmen, also serving as part-time militia cavalry, crossed the Khalkhin-Gol near the village of Nomonhan, an area within the disputed border territory claimed by Manchuria. Historically, the border between Mongolia and Manchuria had been poorly defined, and the nomadic herdsmen, whose lives revolved around grazing their livestock, paid little attention to these political boundaries. However, the geopolitical landscape had changed drastically. Manchuria was under Japanese control and had been renamed Manchukuo, while Mongolia was aligned with the Soviet Union. The Japanese, asserting their claim over Manchuria, insisted that the Khalkhin-Gol River was the rightful border. In contrast, the Mongolians and their Soviet allies contended that the true border lay approximately 30 miles to the east, encompassing Nomonhan. This disagreement over the border was not merely a territorial dispute, but a reflection of deeper geopolitical tensions. The Japanese saw the grazing of Mongolian horses in the contested area as an unacceptable border violation. This incident quickly escalated into a military confrontation, bringing the Soviet Union and Japan to the brink of war. The underlying animosity between these two powers had a long history, dating back to their earliest interactions in the northern waters of Japan. Over time, mutual distrust and hostility had only grown, culminating in this tense standoff at Khalkhin-Gol. The conflict at Khalkhin-Gol, also known as the Battle of Nomonhan, was not just a skirmish over an ill-defined border. It was a critical moment in the broader narrative of Soviet-Japanese relations, showcasing the precarious balance of power in East Asia on the eve of World War II. The clash was a continuation of a long-standing rivalry, with both sides testing each other's resolve and military capabilities. Ultimately, the events at Khalkhin-Gol would have far-reaching implications, influencing both countries' strategies and alliances in the coming global conflict. In the early 20th century, the relationship between Japan and Russia was marked by conflict and rivalry, particularly over Chinese trading rights. This tension culminated in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, a pivotal conflict that ended with Japan's decisive victory over Tsarist Russia. Japan's triumph, achieved through both land and naval battles, marked its emergence as a formidable world power, while Russia faced a humiliating defeat that weakened its influence in the region. The aftermath of World War I and the subsequent Russian Revolution in 1917 further strained relations. Amid the chaos of the Communist Revolution, Japan, along with other Allied powers, sent troops to Siberia, ostensibly to prevent the spread of Bolshevism. However, Japan's true intention was more opportunistic. They sought to annex the resource-rich Siberian territories to expand their empire. The political landscape in Siberia was complex and chaotic, dominated by a mix of ruthless warlords, monarchists, anarchists, and terrorists, all vying for control. In 1938, tensions flared again between the Soviet Union and Japan over territorial disputes. The immediate cause was the Soviet occupation of Chenkufeng Hill, located near the mouth of the Amur River at Lake Khasan, close to the border with Japanese-occupied Korea. The Japanese government viewed this move as a clear violation of existing border agreements and, after diplomatic protests failed to resolve the issue, decided to take military action to remove the Soviet forces from the area. Japanese military doctrine at the time emphasized the effectiveness of night attacks designed to surprise and overwhelm the enemy. Following this strategy, Japanese forces launched a sudden nighttime assault on the Soviet positions at Chenkufeng Hill. The assault led to intense hand-to-hand combat, catching the Soviet defenders off guard and temporarily driving them from the contested position. The Japanese then fortified their gains and prepared for the inevitable Soviet counterattack. For 12 days, the Japanese forces held their ground against relentless Soviet artillery and air bombardments. Despite suffering significant casualties, they managed to withstand the initial Soviet efforts to retake the hill. However, the Soviet response, while initially sluggish and disorganized, possibly a reflection of the recent purges that had weakened the Red Army's leadership, eventually became more coordinated. The Soviets mobilized superior numbers and heavier firepower, eventually overwhelming the Japanese positions and reclaiming the hill. The Battle of Lake Khasan was a short but bitter conflict, resulting in approximately 2,500 casualties on both sides. The battle imparted crucial lessons to both the Soviets and the Japanese. For the Soviets, the encounter underscored the weaknesses in their military readiness, exacerbated by Stalin's purges, which had decimated the ranks of experienced military officers. The conflict highlighted the need for better coordinated defensive strategies and greater depth in their defensive lines. On the other hand, the Japanese, unable to match the industrial might of the Soviets and other European powers, concluded that their strength lay in their highly disciplined and well-trained infantry. The experience at Lake Khasan reinforced their belief in the efficacy of massed night attacks, which they believed could neutralize the Soviet advantages in artillery and armor. Japanese military leaders maintained a strong emphasis on the warrior spirit and the valor of the individual soldier, despite the heavy losses sustained. They held firm to the notion that, through surprise attacks and close-quarters combat, their infantry could achieve swift and decisive victories, as they had demonstrated at Lake Khasan. This conflict further solidified the Japanese doctrine that emphasized aggression and the superiority of the warrior ethos, even in the face of overwhelming odds. This belief system, however, was at odds with the evolving nature of modern warfare, as evidenced by the devastating trench warfare of World War I. Nevertheless, the lessons from Lake Khasan would continue to influence Japanese military strategies in the lead-up to World War II. The Japanese military's fighting doctrine, honed through years of conflict, particularly in China, was characterized by a reliance on the discipline and resolve of its soldiers to overcome numerically superior forces. This approach had repeatedly brought them victories against the Chinese, despite often facing overwhelming odds. The Japanese believed that their well-trained infantry and aggressive tactics could defeat any opponent. However, the incident at Nomonhan in 1939 would challenge this belief and teach them a new lesson. The incident began when Manchurian border guards noticed Mongolian cavalry grazing their horses on the eastern side of the Khalkhin-Gol River, which they considered to be within Manchurian, and by extension Japanese, territory. The Manchurian guards, seeking to usurp control over the disputed area, sent a small squad to chase the Mongols away. The Mongolian horsemen, lightly armed and not prepared for a confrontation, withdrew without resistance. However, this was only a temporary retreat. A few days later, the Mongolians returned in greater numbers, better armed and with the support of their Soviet allies. They brought field artillery and began fortifying their positions, preparing for a possible conflict. The increased presence and fortifications of the Mongolian and Soviet forces quickly outmatched the local Manchurian forces, who, recognizing the escalating threat, called upon their Japanese masters for reinforcement. On May 14, a Japanese patrol led by Lieutenant Colonel Azuma Yozo, consisting of 220 men, was dispatched to handle the situation. The Japanese forces advanced with confidence, expecting another easy victory similar to their previous encounters with numerically superior but less well-organized forces. As they approached, the Mongolian troops once again withdrew without engaging in battle, seemingly unwilling to confront the Japanese directly. However, the Mongolians soon called upon the Soviets for assistance, and the situation began to escalate. Japanese aerial reconnaissance reported that Soviet and Mongolian forces were not only returning in greater numbers but were also heavily reinforcing their positions on the east bank of the Khalkhin-Gol River. They were bringing in more artillery and tanks and constructing defensive fortifications. The Japanese recognized that their adversaries were preparing for a significant conflict. Believing in their own military doctrine and the superiority of their infantry, the Japanese command decided that the Soviets and Mongolians needed to be taught a lesson for their incursion. They underestimated the coordination and capabilities of the Soviet forces and prepared for a confrontation, expecting to leverage their proven tactics of surprise attacks and close-quarters combat to achieve a swift victory. This overconfidence set the stage for a major and unexpected clash at Nomonhan, which would prove to be a critical and humbling experience for the Japanese military. The Japanese military's confidence in their capabilities was deeply ingrained, bolstered by a history of successful military engagements that stretched back to their opening to the west by Commodore Matthew C. Perry's fleet in 1853. This encounter had ended Japan's long period of isolation and set the stage for rapid modernization and militarization. By 1939, the Japanese had amassed a formidable military force equipped with modern weapons and tactics. However, much of their military might was already engaged in China, where they were deeply involved in a protracted conflict. In the case of the emerging conflict at Nomonhan, the Japanese military, specifically the Kuomintang Army stationed in Manchuria, played a crucial and somewhat independent role. The Kuomintang Army, known for its autonomy and aggressive stance, often operated without direct oversight from Tokyo's central military planners. This independence was exemplified by their previous actions and attitudes towards the Soviet Union, influenced heavily by their former commander, Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo. Tojo had a personal and professional history with Russia. Both he and his father had fought against the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, a conflict that ended in a rare victory for an Asian power over a European nation and cemented Japan's status as a rising military power. Tojo's experience and animosity towards Russia were carried with him when he served in Manchuria. In 1935, he took command of a secret police unit in the region, using his position to exert control over the Kuomintang Army. His leadership further solidified the Army's aggressive posture and disdain for Soviet Russia. By late 1936, Tojo had risen to the head of the Kuomintang Army, where he continued to encourage a confrontational approach to border disputes with the Soviets and their allies. His subsequent appointment as Vice Minister of Japan's War Department in Tokyo did little to change the Kuomintang Army's aggressive tendencies. The officers of the Kuomintang Army felt emboldened knowing that Tojo, now in a high-ranking position in the government, was sympathetic to their views and actions. The situation at Nomonhan was exacerbated by this complex dynamic. The Kuomintang Army, eager to assert dominance and respond aggressively to perceived border incursions, was dragging Tokyo into a potentially disastrous conflict. The military leadership in Tokyo, including civilian leaders and the emperor himself, were concerned about the implications of opening a second front against a formidable opponent like the Soviet Union. The emperor, in particular, was known to oppose a war with Russia, wary of overextending Japan's military resources and provoking a powerful adversary. Despite these concerns, the Kuomintang Army's actions were pushing Japan closer to a major confrontation. They mobilized armored cars, tanks, and aircraft to support their operations at Nomonhan, displaying a readiness to escalate the conflict. The Kuomintang Army's aggressive posture, combined with Tokyo's apprehension and the emperor's reluctance, created a tense and precarious situation. The leadership in Tokyo was not entirely opposed to the aggressive actions, but was cautious about the broader strategic implications. The events at Nomonhan were not just a military engagement, but also a reflection of the internal divisions and challenges within Japan's military and political leadership. The conflict would soon escalate into a significant battle, challenging the Japanese doctrine of reliance on infantry and aggressive tactics, and ultimately revealing the limitations of their military strategy and the consequences of unchecked militarism. The Soviet Union, following the revolution, had undertaken significant reforms and modernization efforts in their military. Recognizing the threat posed by Japan, they bolstered their defenses along the Siberian frontier, including constructing a second rail line on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to facilitate rapid troop and supply movements across the vast expanse of Russia. The Soviets also gained valuable combat experience during the Spanish Civil War, where they tested new tactics and equipment. This experience provided them with insights into modern warfare, contrasting sharply with the Japanese, whose recent conflicts had been against the large but poorly mechanized Chinese forces. Despite these advancements, the Soviet military had notable vulnerabilities. Their forces had not fared well in Spain, suffering a defeat that cast doubt on their capabilities. Furthermore, Stalin's purges had decimated the Red Army's officer corps, removing many experienced leaders and creating an atmosphere of distrust and instability. This purge led to a perception of Soviet military weakness, both within and outside the Soviet Union. The Japanese, like many others around the world, viewed the purges as evidence of a weakened and disorganized Russian military. Nevertheless, Stalin was determined not to show weakness in the face of Japanese aggression, particularly over border disputes. He was unwilling to cede any ground, understanding the strategic importance of maintaining a strong posture. Following Lieutenant Colonel Azuma Yalzo's initial victory over the Mongolian and Soviet forces near the Khalkhin-Gol River, Soviet and Mongolian troops quickly reoccupied the contested area, this time in greater numbers and with stronger fortifications. Undeterred, Azuma returned a week later to drive out what he believed were merely pesky invaders. As before, the Soviet and Mongolian forces initially retreated, seemingly avoiding direct confrontation. However, this retreat was a deliberate tactic to lure the Japanese into a vulnerable position. Azuma and his men pursued the withdrawing forces deeper into a harsh, arid region, far from their supply lines and support. Once Azuma's forces were sufficiently isolated, the Soviets launched a well-coordinated counterattack. They struck Azuma's flanks and rear, cutting off his troops from potential reinforcements. Concurrently, a diversionary force engaged the main Japanese units, preventing them from coming to Azuma's aid. The Soviet tactics were precise and effective, exploiting the terrain and the Japanese overconfidence. Trapped and outmaneuvered, Azuma's forces faced a dire situation. Despite their attempts to break free, they suffered catastrophic losses, with over 80% of the unit becoming casualties. This devastating defeat was a significant blow to Japanese pride and military prestige. The Japanese command, humiliated by the setback, decided to escalate the situation. In response to the Soviet challenge, they resolved to deploy an entire division to the area, aiming to decisively crush the Soviet and Mongolian forces and reassert Japanese dominance in the region. This decision marked a critical escalation in the conflict, setting the stage for a much larger and more intense confrontation at Nomonhan, one that would test the limits of both nations' military capabilities and resolve. As the conflict at Nomonhan escalated, it extended into an aerial war where the Japanese initially achieved air superiority. The Japanese Army Air Service deployed its Nakajima Ki-27 fighters, which were lightweight, agile, and well-suited to dogfighting. The Ki-27, with its open cockpit and fixed landing gear, was a monoplane design that, despite its simplicity, proved superior to the Soviet aircraft in the early stages of the conflict. The Soviet Air Force fielded a mix of I-15 and I-16 fighters. The I-15 was an older biplane model, featuring an open cockpit and fixed landing gear, which was largely obsolete by this period. Its limited speed and maneuverability made it ineffective against the more modern Ki-27s. As a result, the I-15s were quickly outmatched and driven from the skies, rendering them ineffective in the face of Japanese air dominance. The I-16, on the other hand, was a more advanced monoplane with an open cockpit and retractable landing gear. It was armed with 2 machine guns and a 20mm cannon, making it capable of delivering substantial firepower. However, despite its armament and innovative design for the time, the I-16 had a relatively stubby, unconventional appearance and suffered from various handling issues. Inexperienced Soviet pilots struggled to compete with the more adept Japanese aviators, leading to significant Soviet losses in the initial air engagements. During this phase, the Japanese leveraged their air superiority not only to dominate aerial combat, but also to provide crucial air support to their ground forces. The Ki-27s executed strafing runs and targeted Soviet positions, disrupting supply lines and communications, and providing direct support to Japanese troops. This effective use of air power contributed to the Japanese forces gaining the upper hand in the early skirmishes at Nomonhan. The combination of superior aircraft performance, pilot experience, and tactical coordination allowed the Japanese to maintain control of the skies. However, this dominance was not to last, as the Soviets would soon respond with increased numbers, improved tactics, and better aircraft, challenging Japanese air superiority and shifting the dynamics of the conflict. The air campaign over Nomonhan was marked by confusion and controversy, with both the Japanese and Soviet forces making exaggerated claims about their successes. At this stage, the Japanese held clear air superiority, as evidenced by Soviet pilots' tendency to avoid aerial combat and instead focus on ground support missions. When confronted by Japanese fighters, the Soviet pilots often retreated, preferring to evade rather than engage in dogfighting. This conflict also saw the early development of Soviet boom and zoom tactics, where pilots would make high-speed passes at enemy aircraft from above and then zoom away, a strategy that would later challenge American pilots during the Korean War. The battle, taking place in the remote and sparsely populated region of Nomonhan, has remained shrouded in historical ambiguity. Several factors contributed to this confusion: the remote location, the lack of independent observers, and the use of different names for geographic features by the opposing forces. The Japanese and Russians each reported inflated victories while downplaying their own casualties. In his 1969 memoirs, General, later Marshal, Georgy Zhukov, who played a pivotal role in the battle, emphasized Soviet successes without fully acknowledging their losses. On June 1, 1939, while overseeing military exercises in Belarusia, Zhukov received orders to report to Army headquarters in Moscow. Upon arrival, he was briefed on the worsening situation in Mongolia and was promptly dispatched to take command of the Soviet forces. Zhukov arrived in the Mongolian capital on June 5 and quickly assessed the dire state of the Soviet military effort. The command structure was in disarray. Senior officers had not visited the front lines, and there were no reliable communication lines to the battlefield. The Japanese controlled the skies, allowing them to move with relative impunity. Moreover, the nearest operational railhead was over 400 miles from the front, complicating logistics and resupply efforts. Determined to understand the situation firsthand, Zhukov rushed to the front. He found a vast, desolate landscape characterized by undulating sand dunes and sparse vegetation. The only reliable source of local drinking water was the Holsted River, a stream that flowed into the saline Halha River. The terrain presented unique challenges. The west bank of the Halha River offered the Soviets a vantage point from which they could observe Japanese movements on the east bank. This gave the Soviets an advantage in positioning artillery and snipers, as the Japanese had little cover to conceal their activities. The rivers, swollen from seasonal rains, made the banks muddy and treacherous, hampering the movement of motorized vehicles. The few dirt roads in the area were often covered by sandstorms or turned into mud by the rain, complicating transportation and supply lines. The weather added to the soldiers' misery with scorching daytime temperatures, frigid nights, and frequent rainstorms. These conditions left both Soviet and Japanese troops soaked, caked in mud, and plagued by mosquitoes. The only solace was the fresh water brought by the rains, which provided some relief in an otherwise harsh environment. Zhukov's arrival and assessment marked a turning point in the Soviet approach to the conflict. Recognizing the need for better coordination and supply, he began to implement changes that would soon shift the balance of power in the battle at Nomonhan. The Nomonhan incident, despite the region's lack of strategic value, escalated into a significant military confrontation between the Soviet Union and Japan. The barren landscape offered little more than grazing land for horses and livestock, with no notable natural resources or tactical advantages. Yet, conflicts often arise in seemingly inconsequential locations, driven by larger geopolitical tensions and the ambitions of the involved parties. For General Georgy Zhukov, the conflict at Nomonhan was not just a border skirmish, but a precursor to broader Japanese territorial ambitions. He believed that Japan harbored designs on Mongolia and the expansive Siberian territories east of Lake Baikal. This assessment was grounded in the historical context of Japanese actions in 1917, during the Russian Civil War, and the prevailing paranoia within the Soviet Union, which viewed external threats with deep suspicion. Zhukov's concerns prompted him to request substantial reinforcements from Moscow, including 3 infantry divisions, a tank brigade, artillery batteries, and aircraft. Stalin, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, approved the deployment of these reinforcements via the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The first to arrive were the aircraft, along with seasoned pilots who had gained combat experience in the Spanish Civil War. These aviators, many of whom were honored as heroes of the Soviet Union, quickly demonstrated their prowess. On June 22, they successfully engaged the Japanese bomber force, marking a turning point in the air campaign. The air war saw both sides making exaggerated claims of victories. Between June 22 and 26, the Soviets reported downing 64 Japanese aircraft while claiming no losses of their own. Similarly, the Japanese asserted they had inflicted significant casualties on the Soviet Air Force. Throughout July, the Japanese claimed 134 air victories, losing only 14 of their planes. The Soviets, in turn, reported achieving a 4-to-1 victory ratio. Despite the conflicting reports, the arrival of experienced Soviet pilots shifted the balance of power in the skies, ending the initial Japanese air superiority and leading to renewed, intense dogfighting. The aerial battles at Nomonhan attracted the attention of international observers, including Claire Chennault, an American advisor in China who would later command the legendary Flying Tigers. Chennault and his fellow expatriate American pilots closely monitored the tactics used in these engagements, seeking insights that would be valuable in future confrontations with Japanese forces. On July 1, the Japanese launched a bold night offensive against Soviet and Mongolian positions on both sides of the Khalkhin Gol, Halha River. The offensive was supported by 73 tanks and aimed to secure high ground on the river's east bank. Additionally, the Japanese constructed a pontoon bridge across the river to assault Soviet reserves and artillery positions on the west bank. This well-coordinated operation allowed them to make significant gains before dawn. As daylight revealed the unfolding situation, General Zhukov acted decisively. Concerned that his artillery might be overwhelmed, he ordered a counterattack with his available tanks and armored cars. Despite the lack of infantry support, most of the reinforcements from Moscow had yet to arrive. Zhukov, drawing on his early career experience commanding a tank regiment, understood the capabilities and potential of these armored units. He deployed them strategically, seeking to halt the Japanese advance and protect his artillery positions. The ensuing tank battle marked a critical phase of the Nomonhan conflict, showcasing the evolving nature of warfare with the use of mechanized units. This engagement underscored the tactical acumen of Zhukov, who would later become renowned for his role in the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The confrontation at Nomonhan, fought in a remote and desolate region, would ultimately have significant implications for the future of Soviet-Japanese relations and the broader strategic landscape in East Asia. In World War I, tanks were initially deployed to support infantry, with a few tanks assigned to each unit to lead assaults, clear obstacles, and provide fire support for advancing troops. The concept was that tanks would break through enemy defenses and then allow infantry to follow and exploit the breach. By the time of the Nomonhan conflict, General Georgy Zhukov was pioneering a more innovative approach to armored warfare. Zhukov's belief was that tanks could form the backbone of their own independent assault units, rather than being merely supportive elements. This approach involved leveraging the tank's mobility, firepower, and protection to conduct operations autonomously, without being constrained by the pace of accompanying infantry. Zhukov's strategy was influenced by the evolving role of tanks in military doctrine. During his early career, Zhukov had commanded a tank regiment and developed a keen understanding of the capabilities and limitations of armored units. He recognized that tanks, with their ability to maneuver across the battlefield and engage enemy positions directly, could be used more effectively than as mere support for infantry. In the context of the Nomonhan conflict, Zhukov's use of tanks was a practical application of this concept. He deployed his tanks to counter the Japanese offensive, leveraging their mobility and firepower to launch counterattacks and protect key positions. This independent use of tanks allowed for more dynamic and flexible responses to enemy movements and attacks, reflecting Zhukov's innovative thinking and adaptation of tank tactics to the needs of the battlefield. This approach foreshadowed later developments in armored warfare, where tanks would come to be seen as central to offensive operations, capable of operating in concert with or even independent of infantry. Zhukov's tactics at Nomonhan demonstrated the potential of tanks as the core of a combat group, paving the way for future advancements in armored warfare doctrine. General Zhukov's strategy to utilize a tank brigade as a primary assault force at Nomonhan was bold, but faced significant challenges. He had assembled around 186 tanks and 250 armored cars, deploying them to strike the Japanese flanks and drive them back towards the Halha River. This maneuver aimed to exploit the tanks' mobility and firepower to break through enemy lines and disrupt Japanese operations. The fighting was intense and brutal. Japanese infantry, lacking tank and artillery support, resorted to using Molotov cocktails, landmines, and 37mm field guns to counter the armored vehicles. They achieved some success, destroying approximately 120 Soviet tanks and armored cars. However, this close-quarters combat took a heavy toll on the Japanese soldiers, who suffered significant casualties in their attempts to disable the Soviet vehicles. Despite the ferocity of the tank assault, the operation did not unfold as Zhukov had envisioned. The battlefield conditions were challenging. Frequent rain turned the terrain into a quagmire, causing tanks and armored cars to become bogged down in the mud. This rain also provided cover for Japanese forces, allowing them to regroup and carry out daring close combat attacks under the cover of darkness. The logistical situation for the Japanese was dire. Their single pontoon bridge across the Halha River could not handle the volume of supplies needed for their forces. Additionally, the other bridges had been sent to China, further straining their resupply efforts. Under constant artillery bombardment and facing overwhelming Soviet firepower, the Japanese were unable to sustain their positions and were forced to retreat across the river. Some Japanese soldiers panicked during the retreat and drowned in the swollen Halha River. On the east side of the river, the situation was equally grim for the Japanese. Soviet resistance hardened after the initial Japanese assault. The Soviet forces, despite suffering significant losses, managed to maintain a strong defensive line. The Japanese advance was met with deadly Russian artillery fire from the west bank, which further impeded their progress. The Soviet defensive position was anchored on a large sand dune and formed a semicircular line extending from the Halha River on the left to the Holst River on the right. The confluence of these rivers served as the rear of the Soviet position. The Soviets had constructed their own bridge at this critical point, which was vital for their logistics and supply. The Russians were determined to hold this position at all costs, recognizing its strategic importance for maintaining their defensive line. Zhukov's tank assault had not achieved the rapid, decisive breakthrough he had hoped for, but it had nonetheless pushed the Japanese forces back and demonstrated the potential of tank-led operations. The harsh weather, logistical challenges, and determined Soviet resistance turned the tide in favor of the Soviets, marking a significant moment in the battle. The protracted conflict at Nomonhan turned into a grueling stalemate as both sides entrenched themselves and intensified their efforts. The Japanese forces, despite their initial successes, found themselves unable to dislodge the Soviets from their strong defensive positions on the east bank of the Halha River. The battle evolved into a test of endurance and firepower, with significant implications for both sides. The Japanese continued their attempts to force the Soviets out of their entrenched positions for 2 weeks. They faced fierce resistance from the Soviet reinforcements, who were bolstered by a substantial increase in numbers and firepower. The Soviets employed political officers to maintain discipline and combat effectiveness, often resorting to harsh measures like shooting deserters or those perceived as shirking their duties. The Japanese soldiers, known for their prowess in close-quarters combat, avoided direct engagements involving bayonets and samurai swords, given the Soviet advantages in these areas. However, they struggled against the Russian artillery bombardments, which they had to endure for extended periods. The Japanese were forced to dig in behind sand dunes, using wooden ammunition boxes to reinforce their foxholes and trenches. The conflict settled into a battle of attrition, characterized by artillery duels. The Russians had a numerical advantage in artillery, fielding about 100 guns compared to the Japanese 80. The Soviet artillery benefited from higher caliber guns that outranged the Japanese artillery for much of the time. Despite a large stockpile of shells, many Russian artillery rounds were duds, contributing to the hazardous conditions on the battlefield with unexploded ordnance scattered around. On July 23, the Japanese launched another major offensive using a classic night attack supported by a massive artillery barrage. They reportedly fired 25,000 artillery rounds, but the Soviet counterfire was even more intense. The Japanese attempted to flank Soviet positions by extending their front south of the Halsted River, achieving some territorial gains but at a heady cost of 5,000 casualties. The Russians, though also suffering significant losses, did not disclose their figures. In support of their offensive, the Japanese conducted airstrikes against Soviet airfields, some of which were located in Siberia. This escalation raised concerns about broadening the conflict, prompting a rare direct intervention from Emperor Hirohito, who condemned the airstrikes. By August, both sides had amassed their full strength along a 15-kilometer front on both sides of the Halsted River. The river became a crucial resource due to its potable water. The Japanese had fielded around 30,000 men, while the Soviets had brought in over 70,000 troops. The Japanese forces were still short on new tanks and armored cars, while Zhukov had secretly assembled 500 tanks and 350 armored cars, an increase from the previous numbers. The new Russian tanks used diesel fuel, making them more resistant to Molotov cocktails compared to earlier gasoline-powered models. Despite these improvements, the famed He-34 tank, which would later become a key asset in the Soviet arsenal, was not yet available. The Soviet reinforcements and improved tactics, combined with the attritional nature of the battle, created a protracted and grueling conflict that would shape the future dynamics of the struggle between Japan and the Soviet Union. The logistical prowess of General Georgy Zhukov during the Nomonhan conflict was indeed impressive, reflecting his meticulous planning and execution under challenging conditions. Despite being stationed over 400 miles from the nearest railhead, Zhukov managed to orchestrate a significant buildup of reinforcements and supplies. His ability to achieve this was a testament to his effective logistics and coordination. The logistical and strategic dynamics of the Nomonhan conflict highlighted the importance of efficient supply lines and resource management in warfare. Zhukov's ability to overcome the vast distances and logistical hurdles underscored his skill as a military leader and set a precedent for future Soviet military campaigns. In early August 1939, Stalin's strategic calculations added a layer of complexity to the already intense conflict at Nomonhan. While the fighting on the ground continued unabated, a significant geopolitical shift was unfolding in the background that would influence the course of the conflict and the broader international landscape. Stalin, aware of the diplomatic negotiations with Nazi Germany, was preparing for a broader strategic advantage. The Soviet Union was in the midst of negotiating a non-aggression pact with Germany, which would ultimately lead to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939. This pact, which included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, effectively neutralized the threat of a two-front war for the Soviet Union. The agreement allowed Stalin to focus his resources and military efforts on the conflict with Japan without worrying about a German invasion from the West. The announcement of the pact stunned the Japanese and the rest of the world. Japan, which had anticipated that Nazi Germany would focus its aggression on Western Europe, suddenly found itself in a precarious position. The agreement between Berlin and Moscow meant that Japan's strategic calculations needed to be reassessed. The Japanese military leaders, already stretched thin by the ongoing conflict in China and the demands of the Nomonhan battle, were deeply concerned about the potential for Soviet aggression in Siberia. Unaware of the full extent of the political developments, the soldiers at Nomonhan continued their grueling fight. Zhukov, leveraging his reputation for strategic cunning, undertook a series of deceptive maneuvers to mislead the Japanese forces. Zhukov discreetly concentrated his troops and equipment while maintaining the appearance of limited Soviet strength. This was accomplished through the use of feints and false signals to keep the Japanese off balance. To conceal the buildup of Soviet forces, the newly arrived tanks were moved at night, accompanied by a constant din created by trucks with removed mufflers. This created an auditory cover that masked the true extent of Soviet preparations. The Soviets used loudspeakers to broadcast fake construction noises and issued leaflets to their troops, emphasizing defensive rather than offensive strategies. This was intended to mislead the Japanese about Soviet intentions and capabilities. From the Japanese viewpoint, the situation appeared to be a testament to their resilience. They were proud of their ability to withstand Soviet attacks and believed they were repelling the enemy's most significant efforts. However, the Japanese were unaware of the extent to which Soviet forces were being reinforced and the strategic maneuvers being employed behind the scenes. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had far-reaching implications for the Nomonhan conflict. Stalin's assurance of Soviet security from a German invasion allowed him to commit additional resources to the fight against Japan, giving the Soviets a crucial edge. The Japanese, facing a deteriorating strategic situation and dealing with internal and external pressures, would soon have to contend with the full force of Soviet reinforcements and tactical ingenuity. The battle at Nomonhan thus became not only a clash of military forces but also a complex interplay of political maneuvering and strategic dissection, reflecting the broader geopolitical shifts of the time. The Battle of Nomonhan reached its climax with the Soviet offensive launched on August 20, 1939, marking a decisive turn in the conflict. General Zhukov's meticulously planned operation would demonstrate his tactical prowess and the effectiveness of Soviet industrial and logistical capabilities. The Japanese forces on the ground were perplexed and demoralized by the sustained Soviet bombardment and the cacophony of engines and construction noises emanating from the Russian lines. The overcast skies hampered Japanese air reconnaissance, preventing them from accurately assessing Soviet strength and movements. Despite the reports from Japanese spotter planes, their commanders were skeptical and often underestimated the enemy's capabilities. Zhukov's attack on August 20 was a masterclass in Soviet military strategy. The key elements of the Soviet offensive included: Zhukov had used noise, feints, and misinformation to conceal his true intentions and buildup. The overcast skies and the Japanese commander's skepticism about aerial reconnaissance further obscured Soviet preparations. The Soviet assault began with a devastating artillery bombardment that softened Japanese defenses and disrupted their communications. Russian planes, now in greater numbers, provided crucial support and were free to operate without significant opposition from Japanese air forces, which had been curtailed by the Emperor's censure of airstrikes against Siberia. The Soviets executed a classic double envelopment maneuver, attacking both flanks of the Japanese positions and encircling them. This tactic, combined with the overwhelming number of tanks and armored cars, effectively trapped the Japanese forces. The encircled Japanese garrisons found themselves cut off from supplies and reinforcements. They were subjected to relentless tank and infantry assaults, which wore them down despite their fierce resistance. The Japanese defenders, already suffering from casualties and exhaustion, struggled to hold their positions. The Soviet forces, leveraging their numerical superiority and logistical support, forced the Japanese into a dire situation. The encircled Japanese forces, isolated and running low on ammunition, eventually succumbed to the Soviet onslaught. Attempts by Japanese forces outside the encirclement to break through were thwarted by Soviet tanks and defensive positions. The Soviet victory at Nomonhan had profound implications. The Japanese military leadership, stunned by the Soviet offensive, reassessed their strategy and the feasibility of further aggression against the Soviet Union. The failure to break the Soviet encirclement and the heavy casualties sustained led to a strategic withdrawal and a rethinking of Japan's ambitions in Mongolia and Siberia. The victory bolstered Soviet confidence and demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet industrial and logistical capabilities. It also showcased Zhukov's skill in large-scale operations and his ability to adapt and exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. The timing of the Soviet offensive, coinciding with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, highlighted the complex interplay of international diplomacy and military strategy. The pact's signing allowed the Soviet Union to focus on the Japanese threat without worrying about a potential German invasion from the West. The battle at Nomonhan thus exemplified the intricate dynamics of early 20th century warfare, where tactical brilliance, logistical capabilities, and geopolitical maneuvers intertwined to shape the course of history. The Battle of Nomonhan, though often overshadowed by larger events, was a critical episode in the lead-up to World War II. It showcased the evolving nature of warfare, emphasizing the effectiveness of large-scale tank offensives and the strategic importance of logistics and dissection. The battle highlighted the brutal realities of modern combat and foreshadowed the massive carnage that would characterize the subsequent global conflicts. The experience gained from Nomonhan influenced military strategies in both the Pacific and European theaters, as the lessons of material superiority, tactical innovation, and geopolitical maneuvering were applied in larger-scale battles. Despite its relative obscurity, Nomonhan served as a pivotal testing ground